one of the most important things in our lives for the vast majority of people is family, is some type of relationship, right? Even if it's not family, really close friends. And so our relationships are really what give life meaning. And research really backs this up.
Hey, I'm Jonathan, otherwise known as Do Better Jonathan.
Hey, I'm Justin, a therapist that's spent over a decade helping couples.
Welcome to Relationships, a Do Better podcast. This podcast explores conversations every couple should be having and how we can do better as partners.
So far in this podcast, we've explored mental load, we've explored parenting, fairness, and communication in relationships. We realized that we haven't covered a bit of a glaring question for us. Why do relationships, why do they really matter? Western society is becoming highly individualized. You go to the gym alone, you complete hobbies alone, you pursue your goals alone. So why do relationships, why do they really matter in our society? Why do they matter today? Well, today we are talking to an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri, Dr. Cale Monk. Dr. Monk has completed some fascinating research to really answer this exact question. So we thought that we'd be able to bring him along to help us through this. So first, to start off, thank you so much, Dr. Monk. Thank you, Cale, for being able to join us. We're really excited for this today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have the conversation.
All right. Well, to start off, kind of the dreaded little icebreaker of a question, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about what got you to where you are with the University of Missouri.
Okay, so I grew up in a small town in Kansas, actually. So a town of, I want to say it's like 180 or something like that, or at least there were 180 in my school. I graduated with 40 people. And growing up, I really noticed that there were some of my friends who had really healthy, stable relationships, whereas some of my other friends were arguing a lot. And I have always been curious about what's the difference? What are some partners doing well and others aren't doing well? So at K-State, I actually went to do my undergrad at Kansas State University. And I started out as pre-med because we didn't have AP psychology or anything like that. So I knew I could be a lawyer, I could be a doctor, or I could be a teacher. And I was like, I'll be a doctor. And I loved my biology classes, but then I took a psychology class and later a family science class and fell in love with it and thought that it was really interesting. And it was answering a lot of questions that I had about how families function, how relationships function. And so I knew from that point, I wanted to go on and be a therapist. That's actually how I met Justin. We did our undergrad together at Kansas State. And then I did my master's there as well in couple and family therapy. And I remember actually, interestingly, being really nervous about seeing couples. And they always ask this question. I don't know if in your program, Justin, if they ask you like what presenting issues or what populations you have concerns about working with. And I actually put couples that I didn't want to work with couples. I wanted to work with adolescents because I was like, oh, teenagers, they won't know that I don't know what I'm talking about. And so I'll just work with teenagers. And then I got placed at like a middle school and I was like, this is actually terrible. Like walking through the hallways, I was in my like mid 20s, but I felt like I was back to being a 13-year-old where I'm like, oh, they're judging what I'm wearing. And so like they wouldn't listen. And it was just really challenging doing group therapy with adolescents. And so I was like, you know what, I'll actually try working with couples. And I fell in love working with adult couples. It was really enjoyable. And I started to really notice, regardless of if I was seeing the couple themselves or if I was seeing an individual in the room and they were talking about their relationships, if whatever they were coming in presenting with, like maybe it's anxiety or depression, there was usually some relationship issue tied to it. It was their partner who was making them really nervous or stressed, or making them feel really down and sad. And so I really wanted to know, like, how are their relationships impacting their mental health and their physical health, their overall well-being, their outlook on life. And so that's when I went to the University of Illinois to get my PhD in human development and family science there, and specialized in relationship science, which is a whole field of study that I never even knew existed. And so until I went to college and learned all about it. So that's just a little bit about me. I am married. I almost said currently married. But I am married and have a 5-year-old daughter at home. So missing out on a bedtime routine. So don't mind that.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about your research, especially as a content creator. I post content. Oftentimes, it's a little controversial, where it's between couples and they're struggling or have these dynamics where they're fighting, they comment in their anger. And a lot of times I see women saying, this is why I will never marry, or I'd rather be single. And then likewise, I see men saying the same things where it's like, I would rather be single than married. And so, I personally think marriage is a wonderful thing that I get a lot out of, but I'm interested to see an actual researcher and someone who is a professional in the space. How do relationships impact us? You're talking about the mental health earlier when you're talking about yourself. So how does relationships impact our mental health?
Yeah, I'll definitely answer that question in a second, but I also want to tap into something that you said before, where you were talking about how people feel like relationships are a lot of work. And that's sort of the crux of a lot of the research that I do. There's this area of relationship science called relationship maintenance. And essentially what that is how do we maintain or keep our relationships going? It's similar to working on a car, right? So like we tend to just take our cars in when the check engine light comes on, right? It's a good idea to do routine maintenance. We rotate our tires, we check the oil regularly, all these things to hopefully prevent some big breakdown, something going on under the hood that maybe we don't see. And relationships are really similar, where we want to be preventative. We don't just want to jump in when there is this big fight that we can't get over. So it's really this idea that we need to be working on our relationships. And sometimes people will go into them with what we call a relationship destiny mentality or relationship destiny beliefs. This is really things like believing in soulmates, for example. You hear that people talk about, oh, you're my soulmate, or I'm looking for my soulmate. Research actually shows that if you believe in soulmates, that it's more likely that your relationship is going to struggle, which is sort of counterintuitive to what we think about. And really, research has found that having that mentality can sort of set us up potentially for failure. It's obviously not always bad, but for example, if we start to fight with our partner, if I believe in soulmates, I might think, okay, we're disagreeing on this issue. You should be reading my mind. I'm automatically going to assume, oh, it's not destiny. It's not fate. You're not my soulmate. It shouldn't be this much work, right? And it's a tricky balance because yes, we shouldn't feel like, oh my gosh, my relationship is exhausting me. It's so much work and it's really impeding my social functioning in all areas of my life. There's definitely something going on under the hood that we need to look at. But all relationships take some degree of effort, right? Sometimes we have to make sacrifices. My wife really likes Royals baseball. I don't really care about baseball. But if she wants to go to a Royals game, I want to support her in doing that. And so I'll go with her and kind of space out while the Royals are playing. And so it's like little sacrifices like that. Is it really damaging me to spend? I feel like those games are like 9 hours, but I'm a drama queen, so it's probably more like 2 hours of my life. And so, yes, I have a Royals blanket underneath. So I'm a fair weather fan, I guess. So what's better, instead of counter to that relationship destiny belief, is what we call relationship growth beliefs. So this is believing that, all relationships do take some degree of effort and I need to actually invest. So it's sort of this idea that I need to water my own lawn versus thinking about the grass is greener elsewhere. And so back to your original question, sorry if I go off on too many tangents. Why do our relationships matter? So typically I always think of this in more of the colloquial sense, like just the way that people generally think about it, is that if I were to ask either of you, what is the most important thing in your life? Like, what do you live for?
Family.
Justin?
No, that's a very good answer, as well as Reese's peanut butter cups.
that motivation, yeah, is there. That delicious chocolate. I did have a student who was trying to like trap me one time, and he was like, my career. And then he thought he got me. And I was like, well, tell me more about that. And he was like, well, I want to make a lot of money. And I was like, why do you want to make a lot of money? And he was like, oh, to support a family. And I was like, oh, okay. So like generally one of the most important things in our lives for the vast majority of people is family, is some type of relationship, right? Even if it's not family, really close friends. And so our relationships are really what give life meaning. And research really backs this up. So there was a meta-analysis done, several meta-analyses, which is basically studies of a bunch of different studies. And so this is across hundreds of studies. They've actually found that social isolation has a stronger impact on how long we live, our mortality, than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, environmental pollution, not getting enough physical activity. And it really depends on, so it's equal to or stronger than those things. And it really depends on how we measure relationships. Is it just like the number of relationships we have, or how much social support someone actually receives? And I'm sure we'll get more into this in a moment, because it is more about the quality of the relationships that we have than the quantity, like how many people are in our lives, right? Because we can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely. And that's something that's sort of an important distinction based on the definition, is that basically loneliness is just that discrepancy or difference between how many relationships or the quality of relationships that we desire to have versus we feel like we actually have. And so again, we can be surrounded by people, interacting with people on a regular basis, but still feel really lonely. And that can have an impact on our well-being.
Yeah, that seems really logical. I do have a question, because I see this quite a bit on Instagram, that I see people cite studies that marriage is a benefit for men. It increases their lifespan, earnings, happiness, like every metric possible. Marriage is good for men. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, for women, it's the opposite. It seems to be a negative. And at least that's what they say on these videos. And I think it's logical that relationships and isolation and everything are good overall for people. Mm-hmm. But what about specifically marriage and men versus women? Do you see that in the research as well? Or is it maybe kind of just more media?
Yeah. So if we just look at averages, so like if we just put a bunch of people into a study and we look at people who are married versus those who are not married, in the past, we've definitely seen, when studies just focused on those things, that married people on average did better in terms of well-being, definitely in terms of things like finances, than single individuals, for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. But since then, we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated, and we've noticed that like nobody's really average, right? And so we want to look at that variability. And so there is a lot of variability. And research shows that if you are in a low quality marriage, that people who are single may actually be better off than people who are in a low quality marriage. Mm-hmm. And that's because when we get into relationships, we experience something called dyadic withdrawal, where we start to spend a lot more time with our partner, especially at the beginning, when we are hopefully, at least in the beginning, in love, and we have those rose-colored glasses on. And so we spend less time with our other social connections, right? We spend less time with friends. We spend less time with our family. not even that we're being isolated. It's just naturally there's only so much time in a day. And when you introduce a new romantic partner, new anyone into your life, that's less time for other people. And so if you're getting the majority of your social interaction with somebody who isn't fulfilling you, you can see how that would be distressing. Which brings me to one of my favorite studies that really made me excited about studying relationships. They actually brought couples into a lab at the Ohio State University, and they administered a small lesion or cut, and they followed them over time. And they found that those in more distressed marriages healed 60% more slowly than those in non-distressed marriages. And so that just goes to show that it's not just, oh, you make me sick, or like you make me depressed. You can literally affect the amount of inflammation in my body's ability to heal, my immune system, that goes to show that it's really the quality of the relationship. It's not just being married and I'm good, right? I'm going to get these benefits. Is that marriage fulfilling? Or have people gotten complacent? Probably what you're seeing, John, in social media is the fact that in a lot of relationships, people can get really complacent, and we can fall into roles where one partner is engaging in a lot of what we call household labor. And they're doing all the dishes. They're doing all the bedtime and wake up routines, pick up and drop off, and they're doing everything. And their partner feels like maybe they're doing their fair share because they're bringing some money into the house. But modern couples, there's usually not just one breadwinner. Most couples, because of the economy the way it is the last couple decades, everybody's in the family has needed to work, right? And so we typically need dual incomes in our homes. And so for most couples, are bringing in money. And so there hasn't really been that shift to equity in all couples. And research shows that those couples who are more equitable in their division of household labor experience the best relationship quality compared to those who may have more unequal roles at home. So I would assume that is the research that you're seeing there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think one thing that I wanted to be able to punctuate really quick, because I love that you're talking about loneliness. And just to echo one thing that you said, Kale, that I love is, why do relationships matter? Because when we're lonely, like our bodies, it sounds like, are just like crying out, and are just in agony overall, having the same health effects as 15 cigarettes a day, that our wounds heal at a much slower pace. I mean, it's amazing how relationships, echoes and ripples through our body. And I'm curious though, when I was hearing you really kind of talk about loneliness, you said quality versus quantity. And I wanted to be curious, tell us maybe a little bit about what makes a relationship, what gives it quality? And it doesn't have to be with a partner. I mean, that would be wonderful, but with our friends, with our family, how would you even define a quality relationship?
Yeah, so it's really, John Gottman puts it this way, that he's a couple therapist. I know Justin knows who he is. But it's really that you love someone and you feel like they have your back and they're in it for the long haul. So it's really these feeling like you're cared for, feeling like you matter. It really goes back to this basic psychological need where we need to feel like we belong. And there was a significant period of time in our history where marriages is where we felt that sense of belonging. And if you didn't get married, then society kind of made you feel like you didn't belong. Whereas now we have a variety of different types of relationships. Some people are choosing to cohabit for long periods of time. And there's different implications for our relationship instability, which we can talk about too, depending on different types of relationships. But having that feeling like your partner is fulfilling you, that this relationship is beneficial, that it's satisfactory, that you can trust your partner, feeling like they have your back. those are sort of the general things that we see that people emphasize when they're talking about the quality of their relationship. Feeling like their partner's committed, they're invested in this, they're putting in that work that we talked about earlier. Those are typically some of the markers that we see as relationship quality. In the research, we often define it as simply satisfaction, which has its pros and cons. But obviously, there's more to a relationship than just being happy with it. But we've looked at a variety of different variables when we think about quality. But going back to Justin, you didn't really ask this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Another study that looked sort of at, or that thinks about the quality issue, like quality versus relationships that aren't of high quality. They actually exposed people to several different viruses. One of them was the common cold virus, and they had them quarantine for 5 to 6 days in basically a hotel. And so they didn't have a lot of interaction. And those who were more socially connected, based on surveys that they did before being quarantined, and those who like had more calls from family members, those sorts of things, they were less likely to develop symptoms of a cold. So it's just another example where those who felt isolated, or they've actually done research that shows that if you have a lot of conflict in your relationship, you're more susceptible to getting sick. And so everybody was exposed. They could have all developed symptoms and actually developed the cold virus in their body. But those in relationships were less likely to, or it was less severe in them, which is pretty cool and interesting. And so really it's that stress response. Your partner's stressing you out. A lot of research shows that creates inflammation. You have cortisol in your body. That's going to greatly affect you.
Kale, I've heard a theory, maybe connecting all of this before, and I'll kind of share it with you, and you can kind of let me know if I'm close or not, if I'm way off in the woods. But it's kind of around like the question of like why does our bodies like really respond like that? And always how it's been sold to me is, as early humans, we were not born with like the sharpest teeth. We weren't born as like the fastest animals on the plains. Like the way that we were really able to survive was by working together and by connection. And that like our survival depended on being a part of a tribe. And that when we were kicked out of a tribe, it relatively equated to death. Like that's what it sold to me. And so that cortisol, that stress hormone that's pumping through our blood, goodness, like it makes sense why it would connect with loneliness. Yeah. Is that consistent or kind of close to what you're seeing or hearing?
Yeah, so that's right on the money, John. I know you're all about banking. You should. So yeah, that we want to be in relationships, and there's sort of this innate drive in us to be connected with other people, because collaboration is how we survive and how we build societies. And so having that cooperation, we can also have a conversation about like, why exactly do relationships impact our health? What are there's a whole field of study in public health where they talk about social determinants of health, where all the social drivers that influence how long we live, for example, how healthy we are, not just lifespan, but health span. And so it's really comes down to things like, if you have a partner who's consistent and cares about you and is looking out for your best interests, they can help you remember your doctor's appointment, right? That mole on your neck looks a little bit funny. You should go get that checked out. Or remind you to take your pill. Did you take your pill today? I spent the holidays with a lot of grandparents, and I was very happy to see their partner saying, "Did you remember to take your pills?" That's one thing that helps us live longer, right? But also we tend to get into habits together, good or bad. So you've heard of peer pressure. That makes it sound like it's always negative, but it can sometimes be positive. So I prefer peer influence or partner influence. We call it couples concordance of health, where essentially we eat very similar things. So we have similar diets. If your partner doesn't really want to exercise, it's less likely you're going to exercise. If one of the strongest predictors of whether or not you're going to be successful in quitting smoking is if your partner also quits smoking. And so there's all these ways that we influence each other's health. One of the stories that I often tell was that there was a period of time where my dad had quit smoking, and I was so proud of him because he'd been like a chain smoker my whole life. And there was like a 6-month period where he stopped smoking, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. And I went back home and he had started smoking again. And I was like, why did you start smoking again? And he said, well, it's really hard for me to go out in the garage and see your mom smoking, or I'll smell it on her, and it really makes me want to have a cigarette. And so that's another example of how I made it sound like my parents don't have a high quality relationship with the context that I put that in. They do, but that is one example of how they can negatively influence each other's health, because that with the smoking. But on my mom's side, she's constantly trying to eat more nutrient dense foods. My friends who are nutrition experts constantly tell me I need to stop calling it healthy foods. It's nutrient dense foods. All foods serve a purpose. But my dad is like, no, I just want to eat this. I would just want to eat cheese on top of this cheese. And so, which again, cheese has its place. Cheese can be healthy, but it probably shouldn't be the only thing that you eat, right?
Tell that to my 3-year-old.
Yeah. Chicken dino nuggets. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So now that we've established that relationships are important and, they are beneficial for both parties when it's a healthy relationship, how do we maintain those relationships to ensure that they are satisfying and healthy?
Yeah. So there's several things. Across our research, when we look at relationship maintenance, we typically find things beneficial, such as we call it assurances of commitment. This is essentially letting your partner know that you're in it for the long haul. And it could be directly by saying, I love you, I want to stay with you. Like marriage is one example of you're providing an assurance. I want to be in a legally binding relationship, but it's not the only way, right? It can be direct by telling them, like, I want to be with you forever. But it can also be indirect by saying things like, when we retire, I really want to travel more together. And so it's sort of cluing your partner in that, this person wants to be with me forever. And then that sort of makes us more comfortable investing. Again, as a finance person, John, you'll probably appreciate and recognize that we're less likely to invest in something that we don't think is going to pay out in the long run. And so relationships are the same way. There's a whole theory called social exchange theory, where we want to maximize the rewards that we get out of a relationship and limit the amount of costs that we incur. And so we typically are negotiating ways that we can find benefits in relationships. And if we make a sacrifice or take on some cost, we expect that to pay out, maybe not consciously, but unconsciously. Like I sacrificed going to baseball games, for example. I'm not consciously thinking about, well, then she owes me something. It's more about like, oh, what benefits my partner benefits me. We call that transformation of motivation, where I am happy seeing my partner happy. And so I'm going to do this for them in the long run. That's going to benefit me because we have a better relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so not so much like keeping score, as you say. We're not keeping score, but it's being able to see like my partner delighted, maybe being able to see and be able to hope that, my partner feels loved and cared for, and an exchange with this social exchange theory. Like that's where it is. Like they'll show up for me. They're going to catch me like this. And all of this, what's so funny, when you're describing a really good relationship, I'm hearing so many like remnants of the attachment theory really kind of being built in as well. Like that security, that secure relationship, that is secure attachment that you can be able to have. And I know that again, we might have like the exact same terms for like a very similar dynamic, but that's almost what I hear you describing is like building that safety, building that security in that
Trust.
relationship.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in attachment, we want to feel like we're bonded to some sort of, like, obviously in childhood, our attachment figure is our parent and we rely on them to meet our needs. That can sort of shift over time to where it's like peers in adolescence, where we get a lot of our need fulfillment, and then to some degree, and then our romantic partners in adulthood, where they're sort of our, for most people, our primary person, but there's an increase in people who are living their lifelong singlehood. So they're getting their attachment needs met elsewhere. But something else you touched on was this idea that not keeping score, right? And so we refer to that. Research has found that we call it exchange relationships versus communal relationships, where an exchange relationship is really that tit for tat, where like, I bought your lunch, now you need to buy my lunch the next time, right? And so that's sort of like keeping your relationship in a certain state, where you might have friends or acquaintances where you're sort of keeping track of, okay, I paid, they need to pay me back, or they owe me this amount of money. Whereas with my child, for example, I do a lot for her and I don't expect her to pay me back, right? Like, she doesn't pay the bills, let me tell you. I feed her every day. Sometimes she usually doesn't appreciate that. It's usually us fighting over her being a picky eater. But I don't expect repayment because we're more of a communal relationship. And so if you find yourself in your relationship sort of regressing to an exchange relationship where you're keeping tally, sort of going back to John's earlier question of feeling like it's inequitable in our relationship, and you notice like, oh, well, I'm doing all the dishes and they're not, that is a signal that we're regressing back into an exchange relationship. What do we need to do? What do we need to look at under the hood in order to get us back to a communal relationship where we feel like things are equitable for both of us? And that may not necessarily be equitable and fair and exactly the same thing. It's more about like, am I getting as much out of it as I'm putting in, regardless of what my partner's putting in? Obviously, if they're putting in a lot, you're getting a lot out of it, but indirectly sometimes. So that exchange versus communal relationship is sort of a framework that helps me think about what these sorts of relationships can look like. Because I remember growing up, I went out to eat with one of my friends. I think this was in high school. And I remember that friend bought my lunch and I was like, oh, I'm going to pay you back as soon as possible. And then I ended up paying them back. And I remember that friend was really offended. And I was like, that's really weird. And now looking back as a relationship researcher, I recognize my friend was thinking we had more of a communal relationship. And it was actually offensive for me to try to pay her back. And so that's sort of downgrading the relationship and making it more like acquaintances.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like that's a trap that a lot of people fall into, where it's, well, I do X, you do Y. Are we 50-50? Are we balanced? And if it's not, it's okay. It's kind of scoreboard comes out like we were talking about earlier. And so, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And of course, you need both partners having that mindset that it's communal and they both are paying in, maximum effort. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But now it's a good way of thinking about it, and just thinking like, I just know how some people in my comments and such, how they talk about their relationships. I can see that they are talking about the relationship like it is an exchange. Mm-hmm. Like, I make the money, so she does this type of thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's a good perspective for me to like think about, and hopefully other people to think about as well. How do you view your relationship? Do you think of it?
Yeah, that may work for some couples, or they may feel like it's working as long as they both agree to it, right? Like, so if we have really compartmentalized roles, and that works for you, fantastic. But it's not going to work for everyone, especially if both partners have to work, for example, or when we introduce a child into the relationship, if they end up having children. That's something where like, I know all this stuff and I know that I should be helping more. And then we had a child and I wasn't as helpful and so I remember my wife would often say like, if you had a client who was not pulling their load or was saying these sorts of things to me, what would you say to that client? So my therapy training actually kind of backfired on me. So, yeah.
Oh, I bet you both get that a lot, because I know when I make content, like literally this week, Julie asked if I could, it was we have like a cord dangling from a TV, and she wants like to hide it and make it look prettier. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll get to that. And then it was like the next day, and she's like, hey, can you do that? I'm like, yeah. And then the next day, she's like, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I'm like, no, I want to make a video on this. Mm-hmm. And she goes, well, then do it. She's like, your content is being more unhelpful than it is being helpful right now. And so I can see that you probably get the same thing where it's, hey, you're supposed to be the expert in relationships. Mm-hmm. And I don't feel like you are being an expert right now.
I often say, do as I say, not as I do. But in premarital counseling, I would often talk to couples about, we talk about it as like events, issues, and hidden issues, where, for example, one of my wife's biggest pet peeves early in our marriage was me leaving socks on the floor. I grew up like just leaving my clothes everywhere. And she's very clean and tidy. And I didn't see it as a big deal because I'm like, they're just socks. But it would make her so mad because deep down, she saw that as a sign of disrespect, because she had told me, I don't like it when you leave your socks on the floor. Please pick them up. And so that's the event. And it's led to this issue of her feeling disrespected. And so it's really important for us to have these conversations before there's an event. That sort of goes back to that preventative maintenance, because we're like heated and escalated. Think of it as like a volcano where there's like this hidden issue that's going to come boiling out. And so it's important for us to have this conversation, probably when we're in like a good, happy mood, we're playing games, like, hey, we need to make sure we pick up our socks. But we tend to just have those conversations when an event happens that triggers us to think about it. And then we're both mad or defensive, which can be really problematic.
What was it like? What actually like clicked? Sorry to put you on the spot, Kale. What clicked for you, or what like helped it actually click in your mind that like stocks equated to disrespect?
I think for me, it was like learning about it, because I remember like in my therapy, because I think it was like my second year of my therapy program, and we had been married for a year. And I remember learning about it and being like, oh, this is why she's getting so mad. And so that was really helpful. And then like there was a shift when we had our daughter, because there was a period of time where I was still, my wife always says that I was very helpful in the first 3 months, and then sort of trailed off, and I went back to like my normal amount of work that I was doing. And like, obviously, as you both know, having children, the amount of work you need to do goes up when you have children. There's a lot more stuff to do. And so it was really her pointing that out to me, and really clearly saying like, I need you to step up and I need you to help more. And my whole life, I thought that I like hated doing the dishes. It was so boring. And I was like, I'll do all the cooking, you do the dishes. And that worked for us for a while. But then when we had a kid, it upended all that, because there's way more dishes and way more other things to clean and wash. And so it got really inequitable. We felt like our relationship was very equitable. And then we had a child. And so I realized I needed to step up and do more in that regard. And then when I started like doing the dishes more, I honestly see it as more of an escape now, because it's like, it's time where it's quiet. A child isn't screaming at you. You're able to just listen to music. You see a dirty dish, it gets clean. It's very satisfying. And so like just changing your mentality sometimes can be really helpful.
I really identify with a lot of what you said. One, I basically have like a same exact storyline, and I think awareness and like education is so vital for men overcoming this burden of understanding the inequity, because it's hard when you just don't know everything that she's doing and like how these dynamics work and such. And like you said, like to you, they're just socks on the floor. Like, what's the big deal? Like, I'll pick them up, like just walk around them. It's not like it's doing anything, but to her, it's such a big disrespect thing. And without, looking into it deeper and thinking about it, and being aware of the disrespect, it's hard for her to communicate that to you without you really like looking into it. And so I think that's why I love like what we're doing here, is because hopefully there's men out there that are listening or trying to learn more and, just educate themselves and become more aware of these dynamics and things in relationships. And that is what I think is the most beneficial for men, is just learning more about relationships and how they work. And that leads to these inequalities becoming more equitable because you understand it more.
Yeah, and maybe I don't understand fully the socks on the floor and why that's disrespectful, but is there something else that I can recognize if my wife did that to me constantly and she wasn't maybe even intending to disrespect me, but I felt disrespected? Then like applying that, I can sort of see where she's coming from, even if I don't understand that specific example. So yeah.
Well, and kind of like the idea that I've really tried to be able to kind of apply myself is it's almost like a general attitude of acceptance. And what I mean by that is like the mantra, if it's important to her, then it's important to me. And so really acknowledging like what is important to her needs to become important to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I cleaned a dish. I know that we're just three dudes on a podcast talking about doing dishes here, but
I love dishes.
I cleaned a pan just earlier, and that's where there was like residual eggs left kind of like all over the sink. And my wife really kind of articulated her discontent for the residual food, especially like how gross the eggs can look. But just kind of the continual reminder of like, if this is important to her, then I need to quickly get to a state of like, all right, like this needs to be important to me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
And because I'm a nerd, I'm going to tell you that is a perfect example of what we call transformation of motivation that I talked about earlier, that like you're recognizing, or John Gottman refers to it as we-ness. And so we're like recognizing that we are a we. We stop just referring to ourselves as you and me. It's we like to do this, not both of us like to do this, or I'm like you and I like to do this. That we identity where you're our like one couple, that is really predictive of having high relationship quality. And it's sort of thinking of yourself and as one with your partner. You have that mutuality. What benefits my partner benefits me. And that's when we lose that and we start having some negative sentiment override and assuming the worst in our partner, that's when it gets really highly predictive of divorce.
Yeah. So speaking of predictiveness of divorce, what are some other behaviors or patterns or things that you see that are big red flags?
Yeah. So you mentioned what are some of the ways that we can maintain our relationships. Another one that we see a lot is gratitude. So expressions of gratitude, like telling your partner what you appreciate. It not only makes them feel valued and like, hey, my partner noticed these things that I'm doing for them and I feel appreciated, but it also reinforces the things that we want them to do more of, like, hey, thank you for picking up your socks. Like, oh, she really noticed and appreciated. I'm going to keep doing that, right? It's motivating. And so that's something that is really beneficial as well. So obviously we want to make our partners feel cared for and appreciated. And then like one of my favorites is engaging in joint activities, especially activities that are novel and exciting. There's a whole framework, a theory that we talk about called self-expansion, where we sometimes lose that excitement, or we feel like we lose that excitement and spark in our relationship. And we really want to get that back. And we can actually keep that passion alive by engaging in more like novel and exciting activities together. Another classic study that was done a long time ago, an early relationship science study, they had people walk across a rickety bridge, and then some people walk across stable ground. And they had like an attractive person at the end who was like asking them questions. And the people who walked across that rickety kind of scary rope bridge were more likely to ask out that attractive person at the end than the people who walked across the stable ground. And it's because of what we call a misattribution of arousal. Like when our blood gets pumping and we get really excited, we attribute that, or like that exciting feeling, we attribute that to the person that we're seeing, the person that we're doing those fun activities with. And so it's a great way to like build up that sense of connection with your partner and feeling like you have more mutual interests together. That's one really great way to grow that we-ness, that transformation of motivation, that cognitive interdependence.
So being able to do maybe accounting on the first date is maybe not the best way to be able to get the blood pumping.
Whoa, speak for yourself. I think you should have a budget meeting day one.
Right.
Yes, that's why it's really important to find people who are similar, right? So there's this misconception that opposites attract. And yes, sometimes we may be attracted to people who are a little bit different than us in some regards. But ultimately, we want to have some like terminal values, things in common. And so if you aren't jazzed by the things that make them excited, for example, does your partner want to be talking about fantasy football all the time? Maybe not. My partner, I love Marvel movies. My wife could not care less about Marvel. And so I end up having to go to those with my friends. And I would love for her to go with me sometime, but I can't expect her to like want to talk about it. I will say that I tricked her into going to see Guardians of the Galaxy because she has a crush on Bradley Cooper. And I said, Bradley Cooper is in this movie. And we get there, and when it shows the credits, it's like, or the beginning of the movie, it's like Bradley Cooper as Rocket Raccoon. And I was like, oh, by the way, he plays a raccoon. And she was so mad, but she made that sacrifice for me. But we want to have things in common. We want to be similar so that we're not disagreeing and arguing all the time. And we can sit down and like, John, if you're with somebody who's really jazzed about accounting, that's probably going to excite you and get your blood pumping, and you're going to have a fun conversation, and you get in what we call flow, where you're like in this state where you're like, oh my gosh, I could talk about this forever. And you feel really connected, and you feel like they are interested in what you're interested in. So then it makes you feel like they're interested in you. And it's just really exciting, right? And so that sort of brings me to another predictor of divorce, is what we call bids for connection. And so every day, this is some more work by John Gottman, where they found that people will often bring up things like, it could be innocuous things like, oh, look at that boat out there. Look at that bird. What do you want for dinner? Anytime you're like trying to connect with your partner and you're asking them a question, you're trying to get something out of them, how people respond to that is one of the strongest predictors of whether or not their relationship is going to last. And so I'll just give a specific example, because basically there's three ways they found that people can respond. There's more of a positive way, which is turning towards your partner and engaging them in the conversation, asking them follow-up questions, really getting into that flow state. There's more of a neutral, which we refer to as turning away. It's not necessarily negative. You acknowledge it, but you sort of change the subject. And then there's the really predictive of divorce, negative, which is turning against, where you're actually mocking them or adversarial. Like, why are you talking about that? And so the example that I always share, we'll go back to the baseball example. So I remember when the Royals went to the World Series, I think it was like in 2015 or 2016. And my wife said, oh, the Royals are going to the World Series. And I was like, oh, that's great. What do you want me to make for dinner? And I could immediately see that she was deflated because this was it hadn't happened since 1985. I
Wow,
know
look at
baseball
you.
facts because of my wife. Um, and so she really wanted to talk about that, and I totally missed it. And so I was like, and I knew this research, and so I was like, oh, I just missed a bid for connection. And so what I should have done was turning toward her that positive response and saying like, oh, that's exciting. What does this mean for the team? Who's your favorite player? How much are tickets? Like really getting in and continuing capitalizing on her excitement. But I mean, it's still, my neutral response was still better than turning against, which would have been like, oh, all you do is talk about the stupid Royals, which may be what I wanted to say, but
or you're going to lose.
Yeah.
So, have you heard of bird theory on social media? It's a trend. Yeah, bird theory. It was a recent trend a couple months ago, and basically, a woman would secretly record, and they would ask their partner, be like, "Hey, I saw a bird outside earlier," and they would see the reaction. And some guys were like, "Oh, cool! Like, what color was it? Or like, what breed? Like, tell me more about it." Mm-hmm. And some people were like, "Okay," and then some others were like, "Why are you talking about birds? Like, who cares about birds?" And so it was interesting to see like all the different reactions. It was basically exactly what you're talking about right there. And it was like a popular trend a couple months ago. My wife tried doing it with me. It was a couple times she tried doing it, and each time I think I did the neutral response. I was just like, "Oh, that's cool." And then I was like, anyway, but then she kept trying it over and over. Like she did like 4 times in a week or something. So I'm like, wow, she really is liking these birds. So I bought her a bird feeder. I was like, you keep talking about birds, so here you go. So I think my reaction was neutral, but I think it was actually a positive. I don't know. I just want to take the credit and brag about that for a second.
Yeah. Like there are some, it's tricky because like there are some ways of like humor and teasing where it's like, why are you so into birds? And as long as they think it's funny, then it could be a turning toward response potentially where like you're still finding ways to connect. But if it is like they are an avid birder and you're making fun of the fact that they enjoy bird watching, that's probably not going to be great for their self-esteem and their self-worth and them feeling like you love them and what they're interested in. So yeah, I think that sounds like a really good example. It's fun how sometimes like TikTok challenges fit. So whenever you see those, John, I want you to send those to me because my students love them. So for example, whenever we talk about attraction, we talk about like what makes people physically attractive. And in a lot of ways, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But there is a lot of universal things that make people attractive. So for example, babies, before they can be socialized and what's attractive, they stare at faces that have been rated by adults more attractive longer than faces that have been rated unattractive, which is interesting. So there is something going on there. And they found that some of those things, like across cultures, for example, facial symmetry. And so like, does your left side of your face, is it aligned? Like are your eyes even? Is your nose crooked? Those like that can make you more physically attractive if you are symmetrical. And I don't know if you remember this, but I got really into TikTok during the pandemic, and I eventually had to get off because it was like addicting. But I remember one of the challenges, and I'm glad that I was on because I showed this in my class and my students love it, where they actually have that facial symmetry, or I think they call it the face mirror app, where it actually shows their faces flipping, if you know what I'm talking about, where it's just their left side mirrored and then their right side mirrored. And some people's faces don't move at all. And then they're like, oh, I'm really attractive. But then there's some people whose like faces and they're like, and then they look devastated. And so we also talk about that, how like when research does this, it's just looking at facial symmetry in isolation. There are so many other things that can make you attractive. Like, are you confident? And so it's not just that, but in isolation, symmetrical face versus non-symmetrical face, yes, people are on average going to rate this as more attractive. But I think back to, I always share this example in the 90s, somebody who was rated or considered objectively attractive was Cindy Crawford, and she had a mole. I think it was like right here. And so that was not symmetrical, but it was something that like stood out. And then everybody was like putting a fake mole above their lip. So I like to share that example to not totally ruin my students' self-esteem when we're talking about research on attractiveness.
In a crazy way. I mean, kind of exhibit A of going against like cultural norms for attractiveness. We could point to Pete Davidson,
Okay.
like everything about him.
Wow. Wow. You're just going to call him out here, huh?
I mean, jump in my comments.
Wow, Justin.
Jump in my comments.
Wow.
I mean, the amount of like wonderful people that he's been able to date when I'm just shocked. And I'm surprised.
It has become a meme where, like, the minute any celebrity breaks up, people will Photoshop in. So that is accurate. But yeah, I was just going to say, like, going back to my wife's crush, I also show Bradley Cooper because his face isn't exactly symmetrical, but people like seem to have the hots for Bradley Cooper. So yeah, what were you going to say, John?
I was going to say, so speaking of your students, kind of putting you on the spot here. Are there any studies or facts or things you share with students, like off the bat, or maybe like something just like that blows their mind, like something that is just like that makes them go wow and just like really think about things?
There are several things, and so I'll share because it's usually around when we talk about like misconceptions about relationships. But one that I always have to share that devastates them is a few things. So, and again, this is averages, but marital quality tends to decline over time. We tend to be at our highest point in relationship satisfaction early in our marriage or during the engagement period. And in some ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, it's not that I think we get more realistic, and it's not that it declines for everyone. That's just the average. But when we look at how people cluster, there are certainly differences where there are people who maintain their quality over time because they're doing some of the things that we talk about. It's just that they don't go above that initial threshold. And some of it is because if you talk to a premarital couple, I've done a lot of premarital counseling. Justin, you probably have too. If you talk to them, they're like, oh my God, we're so in love. And like, I could never be happier. And so they're obviously going to put themselves at the top of that scale, and you have nowhere to go but down, right? So we definitely talk about all those things and how your relationship quality, your satisfaction can decline after having a baby for all the things that we've talked about. And so that I can immediately see their faces like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And then we get into the nuance of it, that it's not as scary as it sounds. And here's some things that you can do to improve your relationship. And there's all these protective factors like getting an education, which can make it so that you make more income. And that could be a protective factor in your relationship because then you don't have that financial stress, for example. Those sorts of things are beneficial. And I went off on a tangent and it's getting late and I forgot what you said or what you
Well, what I would to be able to add to it, if you don't mind, I'm so sorry, is that, I mean, so you were talking just kind of overall about marital satisfaction. And I know it sounds funny. I'm kind of reflecting on my own where, man, it feels as though like my fulfillment, my satisfaction, it almost kind of varies like per day, almost per month. Yeah. Like there are moments in time that I can absolutely say like this week, this month, like I think I'm almost kind of at the peak of it. You know, I'm at the peak of feeling like really, really content and happy. And, you know, part of it, I kind of wonder if it is like in kind of a crazy way, like I feel even deeper in love with my spouse since we've had kids. Mm-hmm. You know, since we as a community, it
more appreciation.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Okay, because we got married, and I hate to say this, and I've already told her this, and kind of made her sad that, you know, we dated for about 8 years before we got married, and when we got married, everything kind of felt the same. You know, like we did our vows, we had a big party. She would hate that I said that, but it felt the same until like kids were added, and then we became like a family, and maybe it's I don't know if it's a relationship satisfaction or maybe it's like my life satisfaction. Maybe that's where the change
Well,
is.
it could be like that you got a more dynamic, nuance, I don't know the word, but like a more complete picture. And so like you went through this big life stage together. And so that's something that can really bond you, and you have a new appreciation or new view of your partner. And so like one thing that I've really grown to appreciate about my partner that I didn't have before is how great of a mom she is. And so, like, when I get really impatient because I'm not a huge fan of toddlers, as it turns out, she is so patient all the time. And so I'm just like flabbergasted at how patient she is. Sometimes I would like her to be that patient with me, but I appreciate that she's able to be that patient. And it's something that makes me want to do better. And we refer to that as the Michelangelo phenomenon, where like our partners want they encourage us to strive to be our best self, the best version of ourselves. So yeah, that totally makes sense to me, Justin. And I remembered what John had asked, if there's something that like blows their minds.
Well, I was just going to continue our tangent real quick. It'd be interesting. Maybe you actually know that there is research on this, but after having a kid, happiness per gender. So, like, we already talked about that having a kid, it kind of makes these inequalities a lot more evident.
Yeah.
And as dads, we're like, oh, it's so great seeing her be a great mom, blah, 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 blah. And not that's blah, 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 blah. But, and then on the other side, oftentimes this presents these inequalities, and that's where couples have a lot of issues. And so on her side, this might be like, I'm doing everything. I'm being a great mom, mm-hmm. and he's not stepping up. So it'd be interesting after kids if there's a stark difference in satisfaction and happiness between moms and dads.
So there's, it can really depend, like the gender effects, on whether or not you are in a different gender relationship, heterosexual or same gender relationship. Because those in same-sex relationships tend to have really high equity. They don't have traditional gender roles typically to fall back on. Or if they do, they're both doing it, like since they share the same gender, I should say. But yes, in different gender relationships, there can be a difference in terms of women in particular experiencing more of that decline in marital satisfaction. And I'll just use me as an example where my wife was definitely like, she physically had the child. I did not. And so like she's recovering. And so I was helpful in that first 3 months, like I said, but then once she was able to get up and get around, I like just didn't even think about it. I just went back into my same routine. And because of how the roles that we've learned over the years as we've grown up, she took on all the stuff, the new stuff that was happening. And it took her telling me like, hey, like we need to wash the bottles. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And so it's stuff like that where it just depends. And it's not necessarily gender. I've met a lot of men who are maybe taking on a lot of that role, but it's because they took an effort and they were raised in a way that led them to be more egalitarian, which essentially is a fancy way of saying more equal in terms of their roles that they're able to do. So I feel like I rambled that answer, but
no, that's great. So yeah, I know you want to go back to other crazy stats, facts, studies.
Well, just one of my favorite things to ask students, because they get really into it, is should I play hard to get? Because they like, I'll literally have 200 students in a class and I'll ask that question and we use like eye clickers for them to vote, but they usually can't contain their excitement. So I'm like, should I play hard to get? And like, you'll hear people be like, yes. And then like, it's like 80% of them, I'm making up that statistic, but it's a lot of them in my classes, typically say like, yes, you should play hard to get. And then it blows their mind when I talk about the research behind it, because research consistently shows we like people who like us. And so the study that I share with them is one where they had like strangers talk to each other, and they had them, the experiment was that they told some of them, the person you were just talking to really likes you. And then they didn't say that same thing to the other group. And they found that those people who heard that the person that they were talking to liked them, they reported liking that other person more. We refer to that as reciprocal liking, than the other group reported their speaking partner. And so, again, we like people who like us. And so the concern with students then is like, well, we say that we should play hard to get because we don't want to seem desperate. And so, yes, I understand that like, we don't want to seem like we could just like any old person. We like everyone. I could be with anybody, or I have a crush on everyone. We don't want to seem desperate, but we don't want to be hard to get for the target of our attraction, the person who we want to be asking us out. We want to be hard to get for everyone but that person. Because if we're playing hard to get against the person, or hard to get for that person who we want to ask us out, they might be assuming that we're not interested, right? And so if we're ignoring them, not laughing at their jokes, giving them the cold shoulder, they're like, that person doesn't like me, not interested. Or they might be interested, but they're assuming that you're going to reject them. And people don't like to be rejected, so they may not even try. And then you'll never know if they really like you. So it's not necessarily that you need to seem desperate. We don't want to seem desperate, but playing hard to get may not be the best approach.
I love what you said, and like kind of concretely, and what it sounds like is that it almost kind of comes down to like body language, right? And so am I shut off? Am I turned
Yeah.
away? Am I cold? Am I disinterested? Am I annoyed? All of those which my toddlers show to me.
Yeah.
Or am I think that there's a difference between like being interested and engaged and being desperate, right? There feels like there's a
Yeah.
difference between those. Usually for me, what I always kind of joke about is, Gary Chapman, he talks about the 5 love languages. And I've always joked that I think that there's actually a 6th one, which is teasing. That's the way that I love to be able to show my love, is through banter and teasing.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels as though that can be like such a really good, positive way to be able to connect with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a very sarcastic person, so I hear you on that. Yeah, the research on love languages has been a little inconsistent. So, and I think some of that is because like we all give and express love a lot of different ways. One thing I do appreciate about it that is in the relationship maintenance research too, is that perception, what we assume or view about our partner, what we perceive that they're doing. Like I believe that you are helping out a lot around the house is more important than whether or not they're actually helping out a lot around the house. And so there is that importance of like recognition of what your partner is doing to express appreciation, for example, or to give assurances of commitment, like we talked about earlier. Needing to be able to hear that is really important in relationships.
Beautiful. Well, man, I absolutely loved being able to talk to you, Kale. Thank you so much for being able to take the time for us, being able to pick your brain, being able to really like jump into your research, your expertise, and really giving us quite a bit to be able to chew on, which I really love. I really, I'm kind of the piece at the very beginning that I wrote down that I really liked. My takeaway is just having I want to make sure I get it correct, like the relationship growth belief, right? And ways to, I think that was again, like to be able to like really enrich our relationship. Is that close? Help me out again. But I remember that was a really, really cool, profound moment for me.
More of a growth mentality, recognizing that relationships take work. Yeah.
Bravo. That is, couldn't have said it better. I loved like that as kind of my takeaway of like, are these my lenses? Do I know that like this relationship is kind of like a muscle that I need to continue to work out so it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger rather than this is just something that happens per se. And so I, I hope to be able to continue to kind of encompass like that belief in my relationships. And hell, and that's probably not only with my wife, right? Like that's probably with my friends, with
Mhm.
my family, with my kids, like knowing that like in all of my relationships, if I continue to nurture it, if I continue to work it out, we'll become like even stronger.
Yeah, all of our relationships are what we make them. And so the amount of work typically that we put into them, where we don't always get that back, but if we keep a relationship stagnant, be that friendship, romantic partners, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So we're going to lose contact with those friends that we don't keep up with. So yeah, I think that in research, yeah, there's actually research on relationship maintenance and friendships, for example, and it's very similar that we need to continue those connections for the people who matter to us.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you're saying too, and that's like especially it's a lot of work, but why it's a lot of work, or like why it's important is because of all these benefits of a healthy. I don't know. Healthy was about the nutrition. I was like, oh, what am I supposed to say? Healthy, healthy marriage. Where the more negative ones, they have detrimental effects when compared to being single. So I think that just really highlights the importance of putting in the effort and work. But also when you're talking about the maintenance of the relationships, talking about, why it's important to do novelty things and get out and about and do something exciting. Because a lot of times, it's hard when you have a young kid, multiple kids, you not necessarily always have a support network where you feel like you can get out and about, and just how important it is just to, even if you can't get out, but just having a planned date night in the house or a date night doing something. Just, I mean, of course you talk about, it's important, but showing that like, hey, research actually shows how big of an effect this has on marriages and satisfaction. I think it's just a good takeaway as well. Just like be intentional about maintaining your relationship. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it.
Yeah, and like the date nights, people will often assume like they don't need to break the bank, but people will assume that like, oh, we got to go to a fancy dinner, we got to go do all these like traditional things that you do on a date, right? But you can decide with your partner what is going to be fulfilling for you, and usually the more like novel and exciting, the more beneficial. So I'll give you, again, I'm a nerd. You're not going to bring a relationship researcher or researcher on this podcast and not talk about studies. So the last study that I'll talk about is one where they brought couples in and they tied them together and had them crawl around on all fours. I've actually seen like the lab videos of it. And they had them basically pushing like a foam cylinder across like an obstacle course. Again, they're like tied at the hip. And like, it's as ridiculous as it sounds. And just having them do this like ridiculous, funny activity, those couples reported more relationship quality than couples who did just like a mundane activity together. And so something that gets you like laughing, something that gets you having fun that's within your comfort zone, is going to be beneficial for your relationship. So get creative with it. And opportunities to connect. So building that sense of humor, that novelty, but also asking each other like in-depth questions, like what's your goal? Where do you want to be in 10 years? We may assume that we know those things, but people change over time. So having those conversations and making space in your mind, relationship researchers and couple therapists refer to it as love maps. So like building up how much you know about that partner, making them feel like you're interested in them and really getting to know them so that you know how to show them love, and appreciation can be really beneficial while building that intimacy.
All right, Justin, when we do our one-on-one recap in a few weeks, I want to hear about what date idea you came up with. All right.
Deal. Done. I already got him.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was really insightful. I know we got a lot out of it. So really thank you for taking the time to meet with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Please join us next time. We are talking to Maddie Sanders with To Be Organized, a professional organization solutions company. We plan to explore clutter and how it can affect a partner and their mental health. We're really excited for this talk, and we think you'll like it too. So wherever you're listening, please leave us a comment, review. We want to know how we're doing. Good, bad, let us know. We'll see you next time.
Please take care of yourself and the people that you love.